Hello, and welcome back to another episode of International Immersion, a podcast where we seek to explore the world, examining people, culture, and the myriad of other factors that go along with it. For today's episode, I have a unique thing to present to everyone in that we're going to be talking to my father, who's had a lot of international travel experience in the past, primarily from the 1980s through the first decade of the 2000s. So, Dad, it's really great to have you here today, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I appreciate that, Sean. It's always good when we get a chance to talk, right?
That it is.
This is a special one. Yeah, I have to say that my first experience with international travel came as a result of getting a job in a footwear import company in the mid-'80s. And as a result of working in their development department, I had an art degree, so I got into design in that respect. So as an organic development of being a, quote, developer, in that field at the time, first of all, the company was what we call it's like a middleman or a third-party administrator for designs, the popular price, which is like your Walmarts, your Kmarts, your Payless shoe stores at the time, and a lot of mom and pop, shoe stores that, aren't around anymore. But at that particular time, we, a TPA, a third-party administrator, that did designs, or we called lines of product that we would present, to these retailers, through their buying department. And we would also make sure that everything was up to date. There was fashion stuff. There was a lot of different aspects to developing, the product that they would eventually, land on in terms of what they wanted to source for us. And that's the other side of that business, the import side of the business. It was about sourcing. So not only did we provide them with, design capacity based on current trends and fashions and things like that, but we also had relationships with companies primarily based in Taiwan at the time that had relationships with factories, all over the Asian part of the Pacific Rim, Korea, China, Taiwan, obviously, to a certain and lesser extent, Thailand and Indonesia a little bit later on in that company's development. So right around 1989, I had gotten into a position from just doing design artwork to actually into a line builder position, which was an actual builder of product lines. And part of that job was to go around the United States to these different retailer headquarters and work with the sales force in providing the best product that they would be able to then turn into a store product through our sourcing department. So as a result of that, line builders, part of the job description was international travel. And as is still the case today, the production, the sourcing of that product happens on the Asian part of the Pacific Rim primarily. And you can see this, still today in a lot of any type of business publications or, stories or documentaries about that. So that really hasn't changed. So going back to 1989 was my first trip, to the Asian part of the Pacific Rim. The first stop on that trip was Korea. And it's kind of a funny story because I'd never been on an international flight before that was that long. You had to fly from St. Louis at the time, to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle, one of those international ports that then would take you on to, those particular Asian countries.
Yeah, those first flights, those are, it can be a rude awakening or quite an experience.
Yeah, it was, because it was like, I remember telling people when I got back from that first trip, it was like being on a plane for an entire day. And then to a certain extent, because of back then there was a lot more places that you would have to make connecting flights. Like on my first trip, we left from San Francisco to Narita and then on to Seoul. And, so it was besides the time difference and all the jet lag that goes along with that, as you know from your travels, it was I was so excited. I don't think I was affected as much as the later trips that I went on. But it was an economy class. At that point, it wasn't traveling business or first class, which is a whole story in and of itself. But at that point, it was economy. So San Francisco to Narita to Seoul. And I remember getting off the plane in Seoul. It was, fairly, it was a large airport, international airport. And the plane, the 747 we were on, stopped out of the tarmac. And, they brought up the airway and brought us down into the buses. And I remember getting off the plane and took a whiff, of fresh air after being in the plane for, 10, 12 hours. Or longer than that, actually. But I remember one thing in particular. That place smelled like garlic.
Interesting. Very interesting.
It permeated the air. It just smelled like garlic. That was one thing that hit me. That's my first kind of, real bestial kind of memory, of going, to that part of the world, was that Korea smelled like garlic. Of course, I came to love the food, kimchi and things like that, but that was my first memory. So at that point, there was interaction with these sister and brother companies, and we would have a lot of material with us that we had taken. We had the orders or the design criteria and layout of what we wanted to put together, because these organizations also allowed us access to what we call sample plans. Anytime you build, a product for a company, they want an example. So part of these trips were usually a pre-selling trip and then a post-selling trip. Pre-selling trip would be you go over there, make your designs, actually turn them into sample product that can be brought back. Salesforce then can make presentations to retailers where they would then pick the ones they want. So that refine it. But the sourcing trips were the most interesting, because a lot of business trips you spend time, in an office, similar type of situation than what we would do in the States. But then you actually go out on the sourcing part of it to the factories themselves. And all the factories in all the countries that were usually more rural. So you got an opportunity to be able to see the countryside, not just the city. The cities were obviously had a lot of market differences. They're a little bit less these days. A lot of those countries have become more modern from kind of a Western standpoint. But back then, in the late 1989, it wasn't that way. It was still kind of like a Wild West country. You went outside the big cities, it was like going back in time. No different in Korea. There was especially big contrast in China, but I'll kind of get to that. But in Korea, you got an opportunity to see, because we had to go from Seoul down to Busan, because that's where all the feet and footwear was at the time, red. But it was just extremely rural, and the best way to describe it, like going time. Kind of switching over to the China part of that. I'll get to Taiwan here in a second. Kind of moving a little forward in time, the China part of it, we had to go to Hong Kong. And at that particular time, the infrastructure that exists in China, by stark contrast to Hong Kong, was very different. I remember getting in Hong Kong. We had an office there, hooked up with the people, and they made the arrangements for visas and things like that. You were actually able to go to the local offices and get it. If you didn't have a place or weren't able to get it, you just go there and take care of it. You get a double entry visa, because you've been going in and out maybe a couple times. But once that day or two was processed in Hong Kong, we made our way by train up to Shenzhen. And I remember the first through, customs and everything. Western business people, just in that early perception of the situation, was we were looked at very differently. I think at that point China was, developing in a way, exponentially, which we then saw in later decades in as much as they have developed to this point. So, we were kind of welcomed with open arms per se, even at the level where they didn't even know who we were. They assumed that we were business people from the West coming to invest in China. So walking through immigration and customs there really wasn't any type of inspection. There wasn't really any type of scrutiny whatsoever. I mean, people could have been doing nefarious things, and probably could have gotten away with it. I'm sure it's probably different now, but
that's for sure. Things are definitely different now from my experiences.
If you come up to more so, you go, your passports or your visa, they just look at you because a lot of them didn't speak English at all. And of course, I didn't have any kind of effect, of any even break at that point, so they'd look at me, my papers were in order. They'd just say, just go. And then when you got to the customs guy, he'd just look at me and wave his arm. There was never any type of kind of go through your bags type of thing at that point. And that was a very common experience that I had from that point all the way through probably the mid to late 90s. There was never really any kind of scrutiny, for me at least. Maybe there was some for some other people, but it was just assumed that you were an American business person. I was, but assumed that you were. You're not a tourist. Didn't have the same time. Because we had to take invoices when we left the country. So, like any immigration system in any country in the world, I mean, you get a file. I'm sure they had a file up. Which at that point, it was, this guy's a businessman. We know he comes, when he's come in the past, or when he potentially will come, or how many times per year. But that was probably one of the big things that I noticed initially, early on. But what was unique about the first trip to China was probably about a week or two, probably 2 weeks after Tiananmen Square.
Wow, that's talk about timing.
And the really interesting thing about that was normally, a country of 3 billion people, you would think that cities, transit points, whatever it may be, would have been incredibly choked full of people. Well, you can imagine after that, if you have any kind of recollection, I know you do, but, the audience has any recollection of what was going on at that time. That place was like a ghost town.
Interesting, very interesting.
Contrast in later trips, it wasn't lost on me how much of an effect that had on the entire country, because it happened in Beijing. I went through Shenzhen and then drove to Guangzhou, and it was a ghost town. They had the Swan Hotel, but it was considered a 5-star hotel, which is not Western standards, I can tell you that. Still, a comfortable place, clean, Western food, even though there were some elements at that point of the mystery meat factor. But that being said, there was literally nobody on the street. And I think that what I also noticed is that there was written in China support, even down in Guangzhou at that time, what was going on in the country at that point. So, the people, the handlers, our Taiwanese people that were with us, because we didn't go into these situations without Mandarin-speaking folks, and I got to know them over the years very well. I still have friends like what you developed here, but that was the big thing. So at that point, we would venture out. Some of these factories were very far away. We're talking about a day's drive. You drive for 6 or 7 hours out to these rural factory areas, and a lot of them were brand new at the time. They'd just been built because they were trying, make room for the section, of the manufacturing, with footwear. But you always had to make sure that you would hire a local taxi guy. It put like $100 US. That's like it was huge money back then in the late 80s. So it was a big deal. You'd hire him for the day; he was yours. But one of the things you always had to do was make sure he had a spare tire, preferably 2, because at that point they hadn't built the infrastructure to the point even close to what it is now. And a lot of times you get flat tires because the roads were literally dirt roads. And if they were building, some stuff, I can remember one time going up this pseudo on-ramp. It was basically a dirt on-ramp to a section of highway, maybe 6 or 7 miles long because it would shorten the trip, by a little bit. And there was a container truck coming down the opposite direction. And because the road was so bad, rutted, it was rocking back and forth. And as we're going by it in the taxi, it was like, that thing's going to fall right on it. Because it was rocking back and forth that much because the road was so bad.
That's a little frightening, especially seeing that coming toward you and just seeing this thing rock back and forth and like, oh my God, we're going to get crushed by this thing.
That's exactly what was going through my mind at the time. And this is probably a good point to kind of insert. A lot of times when people go for longer trips, like 2, 3, 4 weeks, a month, or more, you start to kind of get impacted by the cultural differences. My experience wasn't so much of the normal shock type of stuff that other people had. I was fascinated with it. And as a result of having the opportunity to travel there the many years I did, I became immersed, the title of your podcast. I became immersed in Asian culture, and as a result, everything from, philosophy to artwork, to just their very simple and beautiful way of life over there, from maybe a more ancient perspective, not so much because of what it became as a social communist country. That was interesting to me, but I was more interested in the people. As a result, I was able to connect with a lot of people, usually through interpreters, unless they spoke English. But, we can potentially touch on the culture. That's like a whole... But, to get back to travel at the time, it was rough. It was rough. It kind of reminded me again of going extremely back into time. Cities were like in the 60s, and then the countryside was going back into the 20s or maybe the start of the 19th century when it came to infrastructure. And, it was, quite frankly, a very polluted country. Piles of small little hamlets that you go through on your way up rural factories. Garbage everywhere. The cities at night in the hotel, you look out your window, it looked like a fog descended because you look up at the light and, you could see, that the air quality was horrible.
Unfortunately, that really hasn't changed too much. I mean, it's not all the time, but for my time over there, there'd be days where at night, the light rays, you could clearly see the pollutants in the air.
That was another kind of memory that I go back to those early days, is just how polluted it was. I remember driving from Guangzhou to some factory, this was probably more in the early 90s, and you'd see these, this black smoke bellowing out of these, tiny little pseudo factories. It wasn't like it was some big giant factory complex that we, had here in the States. It was a small little operation, had this huge smokestack, and it was this bellowing black smoke into the sky. It was almost kind of like what we remember from the media, when the oil fields were burning in Kuwait. I mean, it was literally, it was surreal in that respect. But when we would eventually get out to these factories, which, as I said, a lot of them were brand new, the room for this stuff. It was an interesting setup. First thing is that I think it was one of the earlier trips, may have been the first trip, where they would actually hang these banners with your name on it. Like if you're a celebrity or something that's coming to do a comedy or a rock show or something in front of these factories. And it would say your name, welcome James Severson and so-and-so, and then in Chinese characters, the factory group. So you walk in and you've got their versions of the police, which wasn't the police, it was their security people. And everybody who was anybody in the factory management were all out there, all lined up waiting to meet you.
So say you got the royal treatment when you arrived to many of these places.
You usually arrive there, we'd leave early in the morning, like tried to get there, but when before dinner time or maybe even around lunchtime in a lot of cases. But they'd usher you right in the room. There'd be a brief conversation that our Chinese speaking or Mandarin speaking people would have with the factory folks, and then they would usually either serve an amazing lunch, traditional Chinese lunch, or you would go on a tour of the factory. And the factory is usually broken down into levels. One level being where they made the footwear uppers. It was basically all sewing machines. The other level was we called the lasting line, where they actually had a mold of the foot, that they would then pull the upper material over and then attach the outsole or the sole of the shoe. And each one of them had the QA. So by the time you're inspecting these different things, you get to the end of the line, and all their quality control people, QA quality control people, would be there to show you. And then you would inspect the material for any type of anomalies or things that weren't correct. And my job as a developer was to make sure that the designs were being executed correctly. So that usually the person that I went with was somebody who was either a salesperson or someone in an operations department. But I was very, very close to the process of making sure that that product in mass represented the samples that we made that the client and the retailers had purchased. Yeah, we would go through boxes, we'd open things, and there was a number of times over the years we actually stopped the entire production on either one floor or the entire factory so that we could correct something. Either it was some type of design flaw that needed to be fixed, which obviously I was a big part of in terms of how those components were put together, but also in terms of quality control, just bad quality. I remember one time in Indonesia, I stopped an entire factory, probably 800 or 900 workers, because the part of the paint on the outsole was stripping, and if that would have got back to the States, through the consolidator and then to the stores, that would not have gone over well. They probably would have lost a lot of, if not all or more, exceeding our profit margin, which at our level of business was very thin overall. But there was one story that I want to tell, and then maybe if you have a question or I'll pause. But one story was that we went to a very rural factory, and I don't think these people had ever seen, a black. And my boss at the time, one of my mentors in the business, he was a black gentleman. And, we went into the factory, and these people were looking at him like he was an alien. They'd never seen, obviously media is not what people enjoy today, or even back then. They just didn't have the type of media. Someone had a TV, everyone and their friends would show up to watch it on a Friday night or a Saturday night when they weren't working. They just didn't have that access. So they really had not seen necessarily a black gentleman or black person in person. And I'll never forget the look. Their eyes were bugging out of their heads. Every place he would go in the factory, besides the people who we were working, our Taiwanese handlers, or the management factory, they looked like an alien to them. They'd never seen, someone with dark skin like that. And that really, it dawned on me that one of the things that was the most dramatic that I took from my overall experience, of traveling there, was that it allowed you to appreciate difference. The idea that other people or other human beings, regardless of race in the world, they have their own sense of wonder. They have their own sense of perspective. They see the world in a particular way that a lot of people don't get that opportunity to go. It changes you. It changes your perception of the world. It makes you kind of feel like we're more one big family as opposed to, just different countries with different systems of government or whatever it was. At that point, it wasn't about being in communist China. It was about, wow, this place is fascinating on a human level. And I think that's the one singular thing that I carried out of that whole experience that, it served me, later in life, my personal relationships, whatever it may be. It really changed the way I looked at the world.
No, and and from my own experiences overseas, I completely agree with you on that. These experiences change you, and they really, I'd say modify or just kind of amplify a lot of things. And I've also come away that I'm able to deal with people and to communicate with people more effectively because you have a wider range of customs, traditions, etc. that you have encountered and that you can understand, and you know how to engage them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. But I must say, it's just amazing to see the differences, from you being overseas and particularly in China in the late 80s through the 90s and 2000s, and my own time in the early 2013 to 2018. So while there are some things that are similar, there's been so much that has changed in that period of time.
Yeah, Walmart's over there now. They did at the last end of my trip. Big difference. I mean, before, you go into, this is kind of a funny story. It's not meant to be rated, or charged or anything like that, but I remember going into, what they would consider a 7-Eleven back in the early 90s, and they'd have toothpaste, with a picture of a guaylo on it, and the name of the toothpaste was White Ghost.
Yeah, you couldn't. Yeah. There's so many things like that I've seen in China that you just could not get away with here, and
I don't think they meant it to be necessarily derogatory to.
No, you're absolutely right. It's just that they're a homogeneous society where everyone is very similar. There are 53 different ethnicities, but they're still much more homogeneous than the U.S. is. So there's not that same idea or concept of kind of racial epithets or problems with more race.
Toothpaste was white, so it seemed appropriate for them. And that's another thing that I noticed about the general Asian culture, specifically what I experienced in China, is that it's exactly what you said. It's that they're very practical when it comes to certain things. That's a very kind of gross level example, the toothpaste. But, they're very practical, and that translates into the simplicity of their lifestyle. And I think that affected me later in life, too, because I didn't necessarily feel that certain luxuries or things that, kind of people aspire to were really that important. Because I'd seen people living on, what would be the equivalent of US dollar a day, and they were getting by just fine. They were happy. They got together maybe in a less media-driven environment where they were actually interacting with each other. What remnants of the culture had existed, pre to Mao Zedong, would come through in its, their temples and the things that, had made it through the Cultural Revolution or whatever, however you'd like to describe it. But that human element was it changed me deeply.
No, and I think that anyone who travels, they are definitely affected or changed. But I think a lot of people, when they do travel, as you mentioned, that they really they can't deal with it, or they can't. It's too much for them. Because I've known many people I met in China. They were over there, but they could not adapt, or they could not kind of venture outside their comfort zone. It was just too much for them. They just were not mentally capable of dealing with it.
Yeah, traditional culture shock. Yeah, I didn't really experience that, and I don't think you did either. Really.
No. There were some things that were shocking for sure, but I never had a time where I'm like, oh, I can't do that. Oh, I'm not willing to do that. I was just like, well, I'm here. I'm willing to do what they're doing as long as it's not dangerous.
Yeah, that's true, because I saw some people that I did travel there one time only. That did have one gentleman in particular. He pretty much had a nervous breakdown.
That's really sad.
To be sent home because it was such a shock to him. And I guess I kind of look back at that experience and wonder why. But as you said, it's individual. So that was just what his experience was. It just wasn't mine.
Yeah, and there are so many factors that can affect how people will act in different places, and and I think it just boils down to a wide range of factors. There's not one specific catalyst, but I think it just depends on a wide range of people. Some people are much more homebound, and you get them out of their comfort zone, they just can't deal with it, or they can't deal with it as much.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Deeper into the travel that I went in the 90s, I got to know these people. They were inviting me to their homes, and it was exactly that. There was a sense of family again, that really kind of gave me some perspective on how our relationships are different here. But it was appreciation. The way that they take care of their elderly is one example, but it was another aspect, cultural wise, that I drank it up.
No, I think you bring a good point. I think anytime you travel, as long as you show an interest or you demonstrate the ability that I'm here, I'm curious, I want to learn, that opens the most doors by far. Is when the locals or the people you're dealing with, they know you're interested in them, their culture, their beliefs, and while you may not, take them on, you just want to know about them. I think that really, that's from my experiences, by having that attitude, it opens so many doors.
Yeah, it does. It gave me access to elements of their culture and their lifestyle that I would not have been able to experience if I hadn't been curious, as you very succinctly put.
Yeah, and one thing with any culture, I think food is one of those big aspects because I've noticed that when I was over there, I'd go to places or meet people and I'd be invited for dinner or do stuff like that. I would try almost anything they offered me, as long as it wasn't something crazy. Like I wouldn't try dog, or I wouldn't try something really maybe potentially dangerous or unhealthy. But
Right.
By simply doing that and being willing to try their cuisine, that was just, oh my gosh, this foreigner's actually doing that. We've never heard of foreigners trying this food, but he's doing it. That's so wonderful. But I met so many people who they were like, nope, I can't do that. Nope. Like, I'm like, okay, but you're in another country. Maybe you should try. No, I can't do that. And it's like, well, why? I mean, I know there's safety. I know there's preference, but by doing that, it really kind of can send the wrong message or put off hospitality on the locals' end.
Yeah, most definitely. That old adage, "You are what you eat." Their cuisine is as much a part or much baked into their culture as pretty much anything else. And there were things that I really liked. And over the years, obviously you develop a taste of seafood in any country. And
oh yeah, there are many dishes that I miss.
Yeah, so it was, it was great. I'm glad and feel very fortunate that I was able to have those experiences, and then moving from China and Taiwan to see the the differences and the similarities and how those cultures, because Taiwan kind of developed from Chiang Kai-shek, when he came across from that particular part of China, kind of established what is modern day Taiwan.
Yeah, and in fact, they didn't go through a cultural revolution. There wasn't a lot of the upheavals that happened during the 50s, 60s, and 70s like there were in mainland China.
Yeah, back in the 80s, there was a much more of a Western feel to certain aspects of their cities, and obviously being an island, even their rural areas, did still have a little bit of that Western feel. They had even McDonald's and pizza at a point in time, where China and other places didn't. But yeah, I think in one time in Korea, I can't be 100% sure, but I dog one time, not intentionally, but I think it's just because it was offered. Bulgogi. Bulgogi can be a Korean ox, it could be cow, it could be dog.
Yeah, there are those situations where you unintentionally eat something and afterward you may find out what it is and you're like, oh, I ate that. And it can be a little uncomfortable, but it's like, well, it is what it is. I've done it.
And like I said, it wasn't intentional. It wasn't necessarily because personally myself, I'm very much into animal activism, to the extent that I enjoy it. But that notwithstanding, the culture and the food being embedded together was a huge part of that experience, and just the hospitality as well. That's another thing that really struck me over the years, was how hospitable a lot of those folks were once they realized, as you said, that you were interested, in their culture, not just the business part of it. Business part of it we could potentially talk about in another episode, but getting the opportunity, they're very, for lack of a better term, they're very joyous people when it comes to certain things.
For sure.
Very accommodating and very, they were really interested in you being comfortable, and being taken care of, and kept safe. there was a number of times, there was a factory incident when we had a little bit of an uprising.
Oh my, that had to be a bit frightening.
We were protected. We were considered, because we had developed those relationships. They're very much into playing hard and working hard. Many, many, many different situations that I could describe. Probably be an R-rated show, but
well, we can always do an episode of our craziest experiences overseas. That'd be a great one to discuss.
But very much so. I mean, they're into having a good time, and they want to make sure that you're having a good time too. I mean, it was very inclusive, or inclusionary. It was very inclusionary in that respect.
No, I definitely can relate, and I will definitely corroborate that from my time there. They want to take care of you. You're a guest, especially if you're helping them, or you can learn from each other. There's a lot of opportunities to do stuff, and they really like to work hard and party hard. That has not changed.
Yeah, there's another interesting story where you know it because you've been there, but there's a lot of fish. A lot of fish is local, and they have the fish that are the river fish and the sea fish or the lake fish. The river fish tended to have a lot more bones in them, tiny little bones, and they.
Oh yes. It's good fish, but it's a pain in the rear to eat.
That's right. Very difficult to eat. I mean, some of it was very delicious, but it had a lot of little bones in it. So there was one trip I went over there. It was in China, and ate some river fish for lunch and got a bone stuck in the back of my throat. Not a big one, but one of the tiny thin ones. And I just couldn't get it out. I was eating crackers and all kinds of stuff trying to get it out, so I had to go to a local clinic. Now, because my handlers, my friends, were Taiwanese, they took me to a Taiwanese doctor that serviced them in that local area. I think it was Dongguan, which is south of Guangzhou. And a lot of the nurses and employees there were local. And when they took me back, to extract this thing from the back of my throat, there must have been like 6 or 7 nurses in there, because they just wanted to see the white person, the Westerner. They wanted to see the foreigner. So I got this doctor with this thing down my throat, pulling this bone out, and he got 6 nurses standing there looking at me.
Yeah, I mean that's cool, but it's also a bit unnerving. The doctor's trying to pull a bone out of you, this fish bone out of your throat, and these people are just staring at you. And you're like, "Hi, I'm here because I have a bone stuck in my throat."
They weren't. It wasn't like they had one nurse in there, helping them with this and this. They just wanted to see the foreigner, and he was kind of chuckling to himself about it too. He was a Taiwanese doctor, and he spoke a little bit of English, so we were kind of joking about it afterwards. He goes, "Oh, they just want to see you."
Oh yeah, I mean, I would say that that's definitely not as big anymore because there's so many more foreigners in China now. But I have found some of the more rural areas I have traveled to. That's when you'll see situations like this as well, even today. I mean, if you're in Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou, no, people are so familiar with foreigners. It's not that big of a deal. But the further inland you go into the second tier, third tier cities, that's where you'll see more of those types of situations arise.
Yeah, I remember walking in a rural area in China one time, back to that local hotel, which I have to say it was pretty very different from what we were normally used to staying in. And somebody on a bike rode by with a friend. And sometimes I'll have a whole family on one motorcycle, or loaded down with all kinds of different supplies and things. And the person looked at me and shouted something in Chinese and Mandarin, and I said, "What did he say?" He said, "Oh." That person said, "Hey, look, a foreigner." Yep.
Oh, yeah. I've encountered that situation numerous times myself.
It's endearing. There's a certain endearing aspect to that. That, again, for me, in my perception of it, was just another reason to be more fascinated, with what that culture could teach me.
No, for sure. And it's funny, Dad, because given that I've studied Chinese for a while now, a lot of times people may not know I can speak some Chinese, and they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, a foreigner," and I'll be like, "Yes, I'm a foreigner, and you're a Chinese person," and they just go quiet. Especially with kids, the kids love doing it all the time, and I'll be like, "Yes, I'm a foreigner. You're Chinese. We're both humans and everything," and they're just like,
Yeah, language. Yeah, that was when I get onto the plane in the latter years. Not like you, but I actually knew some things like that. I always, used to the stewardess because I flew Chinese carriers. I think it was China, the Eastern or something. I can't remember the name of it now, but get in the seat, sit down, and say "Sao Jie Qing Tao Pijiu Ma." And they're like, "Oh, you speak Chinese, very well." All I really know, or "Cao Jie Ni Hao Piao Lian," it's like, you're a pretty girl, So.
Yeah, it's funny, and not to go into any vulgarities, but apparently that word now has changed meaning, and now they say "menu" means like beautiful girl. They don't use that anymore. It's taken on more of a sexual or derogatory term now, at least from people I've talked to. But
Well, another aspect of things that have changed, language is another thing that it really, took out of that experience was how diverse language was and how it really colored the way people looked at the world. So, yeah, it would make sense that, language would change, even in a language as old as Chinese with all its dialects. Exactly.
Well, Dad, it's been really good talking to you today about this, and it's really interesting to see going back in time to when you did these things for the first time and some of the things you've done. And we definitely can take some of these concepts and expand upon them in some future episodes. But I just want to thank you for, talking to me today about this and sharing some of our experiences. And, is there anything else you wanted to add or mention before we wrap it up for the day?
No, only that it's been a great experience. I'm glad that we've been able to connect on this because we have similar experiences, ourselves, and getting a chance for me to go back in a time capsule, so to speak, and kind of relive, through this interview, some of those things.
Exactly.
It's really been great. I look forward to, certain, other episodes where we can kind of go into things like business and how business has changed, the landscapes, everything from hotels to the type of people, that a lot of the people in those business circles have changed themselves. And there's all kinds of cool stuff we could talk about.
Awesome, Dad. Well, I really appreciate it again, and it's really interesting. And I think the main thing here that I'm finding that's most fascinating is just kind of we've had similar experiences for different purposes, but we've and seeing the differences and what's remained the same from China and other countries. That's to me that's what's very fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that your program too is the type of thing that's hopefully going to open some people's eyes, and whether they have the chance to actually be able to experience it for themselves, and experience it, vicariously through our experience.
Exactly, and that's my suggestion for anyone who has the opportunity or the ability to travel to go somewhere. Please do it. It will really, I think, give you an experience you'll never forget, and potentially make you a better person. And that's what I would say. I've definitely become more of an eclectic, taking a lot of bits and pieces from the places I've traveled to kind of incorporate in my life, to kind of make things better.
You said it. We're all humans, regardless of what we look like.
Exactly. So, well, Dad, it's been great talking to you again today, and we look forward to doing more episodes. And so, therefore, anyone listening today, please shoot us a comment, send us an email, send us suggestions on what you may want us to cover next or other topics that you're interested in, and we will see you on the next one.
All right, thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sean. Appreciate the opportunity.
No problem, Dad. And we'll catch everyone on the next one. That's all for now.